Well, thanks for coming back and joining me in part 2 of CPU cooling. And we'll just take off right where we finished. In part 1, we talked about heat sinks and fans. And now the third option that quite often is used in concert with heat sinks and fans is the idea of thermal paste. Now you'll also hear these things referred to kind of as a family as thermal interface materials. And you could even see TIM or TIM out there. So if you ever see TIM when you're talking about CPUs, they're talking about thermal paste. Now what exactly is thermal paste? Well, it's a paste that's made, looks kind of like murky, dirty toothpaste. And it's a very, very efficient heat conductive substance. All right. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this to fill microscopic air pockets between the heat sink and the CPU. Best way to understand this is to look at this photograph. So I've got a CPU down here on the motherboard, and I want to set a heat sink down on top of it. So I go buy a heat sink, right, and I put it down on top of the CPU. And to the naked eye, they fit perfectly together. But if I were to get out my microscope and look, the top of the CPU have these little ridges and ruts and scratches in them. And then the bottom of the heat sink that's on top of the CPU has its own ridges and scratches and digs in it. And so as a result, there are these little microscopic air pockets between these things. Now, air is not a very good conductor of heat. And so the heat that is kind of oozing up out of this CPU as we crank it up and really work it hard kind of gets trapped right here. It's a traffic jam. It can't get across the bridge here very fast. And so the heat builds up in the CPU. But if we take thermal paste and smear it all over the CPU first and then push the heat sink down, that thermal interface material, all this in the white right here, kind of oozes into all these cracks. And so now the thermal interface material, or the thermal paste if you will, is touching the CPU. It has forced out all the air and it's touching the heat sink. Now any heat in the CPU can readily move up into the heat sink and then get carried out into the atmosphere and get conducted away, and the heat from the CPU just keeps flowing up and disappearing. And that's very, very good. Okay, so thermal paste is what you use to put a heat sink on top of a CPU and then make sure that we're conducting heat as efficiently as we possibly can and not creating little heat traffic jams with air in there. Now the Star Trek version of CPU cooling is liquid based, and it means just exactly what it sounds like. Liquid is circulated through a block mounted on the CPU. Now you can't see it here necessarily, but on the CPU here, right here, this is mounted over and around the CPU, and liquid gets filtered through this block, and this block is encasing the CPU. And so the heat coming off the CPU is just kind of being conducted out into this unit, and by running cool water through there, the water picks up the heat, takes it back, and it's basically conducted out through the water, just like the radiator in your car engine. If you know anything about the car engine and how the radiator works, this is the very same principle. You can always tell a computer is liquid cooled because you'll actually see the tubes and the pipes that the water or whatever liquid runs through. It's not always water, but oftentimes it is. Now, one of the cool things about CPU cooling is if you can go to the trouble to set all that stuff in the case, you can also notice back here there are cooling expansion cards with it. You can cool memory, you can cool graphics cards, and so a lot of times people will cool other stuff as well, not just the CPU. Now, what's the big advantage? This is so Star Trek-y and so cool. What's the big disadvantage of using liquid-based CPU cooling? Leaks. Try opening up your computer sometime and pouring half a gallon of water in there, okay? Don't do that really, okay? There's an electrical problem. There's all kind of stuff blows up on the motherboard. It will destroy your computer. Do not pour water into your computer, please. That was a joke. So if these things start to leak, you could destroy some components in here. So just watch for that. But this will bring to the end part 2 here. But those are the 4 things in part 1 and part 2, the 4 aspects of CPU cooling that you need to be familiar with on this exam, and you should be able to get past any CPU cooling questions based on the information I've given you here.